All right. Welcome back this week for the next episode of the Seeking Unity webinar. Today's topic, we'll be looking at ministry and authority in the church. These are two topics which are consistently linked together in ecumenical dialogue. And they've been topics since the early 70s. I think the first Lutheran Catholic dialogue statement would have been around 72 or 73, and the Anglican Roman Catholic statement around 73 as well. It gets picked up in discussions between Roman Catholic and Reformed, between Anglicans and Orthodox, between the Methodist Roman Catholic dialogue, and of course in the World Council of Churches text, Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry deals both with ministry and authority questions as well. Authority becomes a question that keeps getting raised in a new way. So there's actually 4 different texts on authority that are written by the Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission. They wrote a statement, then they had what they called an elucidation on it because of questions that were asked, and then they had a second statement, and then they eventually had a third statement in the late 90s. So it's a particularly significant question that keeps arising. So we're going to be talking about that today. Before we get started, there are a couple of things I wanted to announce. First of all, I was alerted earlier today that today is the anniversary of the formation of the United Church 95 years ago. So the United Church, of course, was a highly anticipated ecumenical attempt to bring together 3 different traditions, and while that wasn't completely successful, the United Church has had a strong leadership role in ecumenical work across Canada, as have United Churches around the world. So the United Church of Canada was the first of those uniting churches. So it's very significant day for the United Church. The other anniversary that I'd like to mention is the 60th anniversary of the formation of what was then called the Secretariat for Promoting Christian Unity, which was an office of the Second Vatican Council. It was created as one of the drafting commissions for the Second Vatican Council, and because one of the purposes of the council was the restoration of Christian unity. After the council, the Secretariat was given permanent status as a curial office, and eventually was renamed as the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, which it is today. So 60 years of work, and that's the office that is responsible for coordinating international relations and dialogue. So it's particularly important for the work that we're talking about. So that's 60 years ago this week. A few announcements. The next webinar in this series is 2 weeks from today, and it's going to finish the chapter that we were looking at. So we're going to be looking at Episkopé, Papacy, and the Petrine Ministry. Those aren't the headings that they're used in the document, but I thought that was a little bit more catchy title. So we're not going to have one next week, and then we're going to break for the rest of the summer and start again in September, and probably be about every 2 weeks in September, starting in September. Also, there's the Stewardship Webinar that's been ongoing. Tomorrow is the 4th episode, which is on legacy giving. If you haven't had a chance to sign into that, or if you're looking for information about that, let me know. It's on it's a Zoom meeting like this one, but it's also being live streamed on the Archdiocesan YouTube channel. And it's an ecumenical project together with Anglicans, Lutherans, and Ukrainian Catholics. They've also added an extra episode next week on June 18th, and it's be looking at there's somebody from Canada Helps who is going to be giving an explanation of how to best use Canada Helps with your church donations and how to integrate it on your website and things like that. So that's a little bit of an extra part of that series. There are also going to be some additional things, instructional videos and things like that about how to set up the use of bill payments and other things for churches that are doing online payments and things like that. And finally, the really exciting thing that's happening in the diocese. This Sunday there is a special project on Sunday evening. That's June 14th. It's called the Diocese Tonight, and I haven't been part of the planning of it, but from what I understand from the people who are talking about it, it sounds to me like it's somewhere between a coffee house and a worship service. It's a mix of both. It's going to be some music and some reflections and some people all the way across the diocese. And I know that the group that have been working on this have been out and interviewing people and recording their pieces, their part of the music and doing editing and putting it all together. And so it's a great excitement to see how this works. It started as a pandemic exercise project, to see how we can bring people together, but they're so excited about it. Apparently we're planning to do it again later in the summer and maybe a couple more times in the fall, and maybe it becomes a regular feature of diocesan life. So check that out on Sunday evening at 7 p.m. It will be live streamed from the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Archdiocese Regina. And if you haven't seen the advertising about that, if you want that, email me and I'll make sure I get it out to you. Okay, so that's a lot of announcements, a lot of other things. Let's get started with a prayer before we begin. And I picked from Father Bernard's book again. I picked a prayer because it's the anniversary of the United Church. I picked a prayer submitted by Ron McConnell to this book. And so let us pray. God, you call us to be the Church of Jesus Christ. Increase our love for one another, we pray. Inspire our worship, work, and witness to better reflect your grace. As Jesus crossed boundaries of separation and division to heal and reconcile, empower us to cross such boundaries in our day, to breach walls of rigidity and self-righteousness within and around the Church, to bridge chasms created by poverty and wealth, racism and sexism, and by fear. Help us to receive the gifts of your Spirit revealed in others, in their cultures and traditions, liturgical practices, and theological insights. As your Church, the body of Christ in the world, help us to be a justice-seeking, peacemaking, healing, and reconciling people of faith. As followers of Jesus, the Son of Righteousness, the Prince of Peace, our healer and our reconciliation. Amen. And I probably should have told, for those who don't know Ron McConnell, I probably should have told you who he is. He's a long-serving United Church minister. I knew him, I met him at the World Council of Churches Assembly in Canberra, Australia back in 1991. We were on the bus on the way out to Canberra, and I heard somebody talking about Manitoba next door, and I thought, what on? And he was a minister in Manitoba, and I was from Winnipeg, and we had to go all the way to Australia to meet each other. But so we've been friends ever since, and in touch. And he spent almost 20 years in Saskatoon as minister at McCleary United Church. And he's one of his roles there was he was involved with developing the parish covenant with Holy Spirit parish. He is now in rural Saskatchewan, and so not yet retired, but I guess a little bit less busy than it was in Saskatoon, and I'd lost touch with him for a few years, but I reconnected with him a couple of months ago, and he actually was signed up for the webinar, but I can't be here today. So let's go on with our discussion. We at the last discussion we ended with the sacraments piece, so we would be starting on page 26 of the Church Towards a Common Vision. So the book, everybody's got a copy of it, and we're starting with the under the heading Ministry Within the Church. And I noticed in this section the headings are look a little bit confusing, and part of it is because you'll see some italicized paragraphs with a heading over them, like you see on the second column of page 26, where there's one on ordained ministry. What they were trying to do is similar to what you find in the Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry document, where the main text, which is in regular print, is the basic agreed statement, and then in the boxed section or an italicized section here, it's more of a commentary or suggestion for further thought. So it's not it's not actually the agreed statement, but it's part of the text that was approved by the commission. So the headings on those look a little bit confusing because they're the same font as this. So I found it a little confusing at first, but when I figured out what was going on, it helped. So the first heading, Ministry Within the Church, and a subheading, Ordained Ministry, paragraph 45. All churches affirm the biblical teaching that unlike the many priests of the Old Covenant, Jesus, our high priest, offered his redeeming sacrifice once for all. They differ on the implications they draw from these texts. Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry, that's the 1982 text from the World Council of Churches, noted that ordained ministers, quote, may appropriately be called priests because they fulfill a particularly priestly service by strengthening and building up the royal and prophetic priesthood of the faithful through word and sacraments, through their prayers of intercession, and through their pastoral guidance of the community, close quote. In line with that view, some churches hold that ordained ministry stands in a special relationship with the unique priesthood of Christ that is distinct from, even if it's related to, that royal priesthood described in 1 Peter 2:9. These churches believe that some persons are ordained to a particular priestly function through the sacrament of ordination. Others do not consider ordained ministers as priests, quote unquote, nor do some understand ordination in sacramental terms. Christians disagree as well over the traditional restriction of ordination to the ministry of word and sacrament to men only. So there's a number of key issues mentioned here. The practice of ordination, the sacramental or other understandings of ordination, the use of what terms we use to describe the person in ministry, and whether or not priest is an appropriate one. That was certainly Reformation concern. And priest is used in some traditions, Catholics, Anglicans, Orthodox, but would not be found typically in Lutheran or Reformed traditions or various evangelical, Baptist, Mennonite, etc. So minister is a more common term, widely used across Christian traditions. Pastor was typically used and has become more commonly used in some of the churches that also use the term priest, but find that pastor is also an appropriate designation. whether it's used as a description of their work or as a title, is sometimes a matter of distinction as well. I recently received an email from one of the evangelical pastors, and there was a list of clergy on one of that had gone out on a document, and he asked that his designation be changed from pastor to reverend, because everybody else on the list was reverend, but he still uses pastor too. But he thought that for him it was a designation difference for his tradition between those who were ordained and those who were not. They may all be pastors. There may be a number of pastors, but some of their pastors were not ordained and some were. And so the ones who were designated as reverend. Is anybody else, is there something else anybody would like to comment on in this paragraph? No? You can unmute yourself if you'd like to. Okay. There's also a reference in the last sentence that Christians disagree over the restriction of ordination to men only. This is, of course, a significant issue in the Roman Catholic Church, where it is a lively issue despite official statements, and that is a continuing discussion, and particularly the focus right now on discussions about the ordination of women as deacons. So that's a study process that's ongoing in Rome right now, but also is a lively discussion elsewhere. There are various other questions around suitability for ministry, who can be ordained and who can't. The questions about celibacy aren't mentioned here, but of course that comes up. And a number of different traditions have different ways of understanding these restrictions as well. Okay. In the comment paragraph in italics under ordained ministry, it says ecumenical dialogue has repeatedly shown that issues relating to ordained ministry constitute challenging obstacles on the path to unity. If differences such as those relating to the priesthood of the ordained prohibit full unity, it must continue to be an urgent priority for the churches to discover how they can be overcome. So let me raise a question there. Marie-Louise, you just joined us. We are on page 26 of the document in the second column, looking at the commentary.
Sorry, my apologies, I'm late.
That's okay. So in the italicized paragraph there, it talks about differences that prohibit full unity. So one of the questions that comes up in ecumenical discussions is about whether differences are church dividing, or whether they are they may be matters of diversity, but that are not a matter that should divide the church. Some traditions use a term anaphora. It's a term I've learned from Lutherans that talk about particular teachings or practices or something, which is anaphora, meaning that it's not essential to the nature of the church. And so it is not something that over which you would divide. There's a continuing ecumenical question about what are the criteria for determining what is a church dividing issue. Obviously, that's left up to each church to decide what their criteria are, or what they are going to consider church dividing. But ecumenically, it would be helpful to find those criteria. Stephanie, go ahead.
Just can you explain to me what constitutes something that would divide a church? Like I don't quite. I mean, there's all sorts of issues, and people within different denominations are certainly divided on opinion, but what constitutes a division?
Right. Yeah. So, so questions, for example, as we're going to be talking in this section about ministry, a lot of questions about ministry, particularly about who is ordained, who can be ordained, uh, or the understand. For example, in the Catholic Church, the understanding that the church is formed around um, uh, the the apostolic ministry passed on through the bishops, right? That so if you from a Catholic perspective, to recognize a church as church, we must be able to recognize uh, the the or the orders, sacramental orders within that tradition. So we recognize the Eastern Orthodox churches because we recognize their orders. Um, but and so there, if you look in the guidelines on Eucharistic sharing, Roman Catholics are permitted, from a Roman Catholic perspective, to receive in an Orthodox church. Not always welcome, but they are, at least from the Catholic side, that's allowed. And then there's this little line that says, as well as in other churches which are in in which we recognize the sacramental orders. In other words, it's the criteria of recognizing, in order to recognize them as church in the full sense, they're looking for, Roman Catholic ecclesiology looks for those the sacramental orders.
So are you saying that unity is not possible from the perspective of the Catholic Church unless, um, unless, well, it can't. I mean, the orders can't be recognized the way
Well,
it's there.
right. Well, so that's why that we talked about real but incomplete communion. Right. There are some. There is very definitely a reality to the relationship between the churches because we share in a common baptism. We share so many other aspects of common Christian faith and practice, and that is apostolic. It comes from Christ, passed on through the apostolic witness. So we have that. It is a real communion, but it's also incomplete. It's imperfect. It's impaired. The various different terms that have been used at times. It's impaired by things like a divisions over sacramental ordination or over other questions. So the question is a real, I think, significant one, is to how do we resolve those questions of where we have a division like that? Do we have to presume that every one of those issues is going to be resolved before unity can be possible, or can we have unity by stages, right? As we grow together, as we converge, both in faith and in practice, right? So there isn't an answer to your question about, even if I just answered it just as from a Roman Catholic perspective or just from the official Vatican perspective, it's still complicated. And certainly other churches would have other ways of understanding this question as well. Right. So, okay. That was just a thumbs up. Okay. I thought you were going to say more. Anybody else? Anybody want to follow up? Okay, let's move on. Paragraph 46. There is no single pattern of ministry in the New Testament, though all churches would look to Scripture in seeking to follow the will of the Lord concerning how ordained ministry is to be understood, ordered, and exercised. At times, the Spirit has guided the church to adapt its ministries to contextual needs. Various forms of ministry have been blessed with the gifts of the Spirit. Early writers such as Ignatius of Antioch insisted upon the threefold ministry of bishop, presbyter, and deacon. This pattern of three related ministries can be seen to have roots in the New Testament. Eventually, it became the generally accepted pattern and is still considered normative by many churches today. Catch the many, not all. Some churches, since the time of the Reformation, have adopted different patterns of ministry. Among the several means for maintaining the church's apostolicity, such as the scriptural canon, dogma, and liturgical order, ordained ministry has played an important role. Succession in ministry is meant to serve the apostolic continuity of the church. Okay, so some of those questions about apostolic succession are coming out here. Clearly, the question of threefold order of ministry is a continuing question for some churches. For others, a single order of ministry would be their theological commitment, particularly in Reformed traditions, but it's certainly an ongoing one. About a year and a half ago, 2 summers ago, we had the Anglican, Roman Catholic, Ukrainian Catholic conference on the diaconate. And so, of course, this is predicated on your understanding that ministry, the ordained ministry, has these three different, I don't want to say forms because they're not, the three related ministries of bishop, presbyter, and deacon. And so it was a rather intriguing experience at that conference to hear the Anglicans arguing amongst themselves while Catholics were watching. Anglicans arguing about themselves about whether or not one needed to become a deacon before you could become a priest. Both traditions refer to it as the transitional diaconate. But must one be a deacon before you become a priest? And related to that, if you subsequently are ordained a priest, are you no longer a deacon? And for some of the Anglican traditions, that was their understanding, whereas Catholics would hold that you're always a deacon, but you're even as you become a priest. And if you should become a bishop, you remain a deacon and a bishop and a priest. From an Anglican understanding, or at least from some of the Anglican theologians involved, and this was the point of discussion and just a significant disagreement actually, it was around whether or not it was possible to continue in one ministry when you were now ordered to a next. And so because of for some, the idea that when you take on that next ministry as a priest, that you no longer are a deacon, that they then suggested that it was not appropriate to have a transitional diaconate at all. So interesting questions. It was a new one for me. I'd never encountered that before. And I can't say that I would be able to give clear understanding of why they felt that way. But it's certainly an important question if you understand three orders of ministry. Of course, then, as I said, there are the churches for which there is one order of ministry, even as they may practice multiple different ways of it. So let's use the United Church as an example. The United Church, at least officially, speaks about, as a Reformed tradition, speaks about there is one ministry, which is the ministry of Christ, but is and individuals, people who carry on that ministry. And so they do not speak about three orders of ministry. They speak of just one order of ministry. And yet they have ordained ministers. They have lay pastoral ministers. Or the terminology keeps changing. So Caroline is shaking her head. I know I've got the terminology wrong, but the terminology sometimes what's happened is that the United Church can sometimes have people serving as the minister of a congregation, doing all of the things that is happening that the minister at the next congregation is doing, one is ordained and one isn't. They have different levels of education. They have different, sometimes different responsibilities in different ways, but it's related to sometimes to their means of entry into ministry rather than what they're actually doing. So there's questions that come up around the functions of ministry and the means of formation for ministry are also related to this. Anybody have anything else in this paragraph? Nope. Okay, you're all very quiet. Paragraph 47. Almost all Christian communities today have a formal structure of ministry. Frequently, this structure is diversified and reflects more or less explicitly the threefold pattern that we just described: Episkopos, Presbyteros, Diakonos. Churches remain divided, however, as to whether or not the historic episcopate, meaning bishops ordained in apostolic succession back to the earliest generations of the church, or the apostolic succession of ordained ministry more generally, is something intended by Christ for his community. Some believe that the threefold ministry of bishop, presbyter, and deacon is a sign of continuing faithfulness to the gospel and is vital to the apostolic continuity of the church as a whole. In contrast, others do not view faithfulness to the gospel as closely bound to succession in ministry, and some are wary of the historic episcopate because they see it as vulnerable to abuse and thus potentially harmful to the well-being of the community. Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry, from 1982, for its part, only affirmed that the threefold ministry, quote, may serve today as an expression of the unity we seek and also as a means for achieving it, close quote. So BEM didn't want to take a position on the issue, but certainly raised it. The question of the historic episcopate is an example of what's, as I mentioned to Stephanie, of a way in which, or for some churches to be able to recognize another church and to see in the other church the apostolic continuity, but also it's a criteria sometimes that's used related to the exchange of clergy. So recognizing the ordination. So when clergy should, if there are occasions when clergy move from one church to another, that they look for this question of are they ordained, but it connects back to the historic episcopate. When the Anglican Church of Canada and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada were coming towards their full communion agreement in the year 2000, it's called the Waterloo Declaration. As they were working on that in the 1990s, the key issue for them was whether or not Anglicans could recognize in the Lutheran Church the historic episcopate. And the question, one of the ways in which this was framed, there was a part of it coming out of their dialogue in Canada was a little bit of a reflection on the fact that for Anglicans, the historic episcopate is what they would call is part of the essence of the church. Okay, the church is not a church without the historic episcopate, not full church. It may be sociological or other category, but it's not the full church that is willed by Christ. However, for Lutherans would have said that the historic episcopate is the bene esse of the church. That's for the for the good of the church, but it's not necessarily essential. Okay? Some Lutherans would disagree on that one. The ELCIC in Canada, that was their position. Obviously, if you were, there are some high church Lutheran traditions, like in Sweden, where there's their understanding of ordination and sacramental life of the church, etc., is practically distinguishable from a Roman Catholic perspective. Then they have difficulty recognizing Lutheran clergy from other Lutheran churches. So there is a depends on which Lutheran tradition. So don't it's not all Lutheran. But in the 1990s, what they made that they identified that distinction between the ELCIC and the Anglican Church of Canada. And so the important step that made possible the Waterloo Declaration for full communion between the two churches was when the ELCIC National Convention voted on a resolution that stated that they understood that their bishops, the bishops in the ELCIC, were part of the historic episcopate. And by making that declaration in the Lutheran Church, the Anglican Church was therefore able to recognize that the Lutherans were connecting themselves to that theological understanding and tradition of in which the historic episcopate is a key element of the church, and so therefore that opened up the possibility of a full communion agreement in which they can share clergy, in which they can have free transferability of membership, where they can where they regularly share in the sacraments. Yes, Carolyn. Sorry, you have to unmute. Okay, go ahead. I can't hear you, Carolyn. Oh, there you are. Yep. Still can't hear you. Sorry, Carolyn. Sorry. Can anybody else hear Carolyn?
No,
No?
I can't hear her as well.
No. Okay. Sorry. Can you type it into the chat room, perhaps? Sorry. Anybody else have any comment on this paragraph while Carolyn's typing? Okay. I'd point out as well that the connection here, talking about apostolic continuity and authority here, is going to connect to the authority discussion a little bit in the next paragraphs, but it also ties into some of the other ecumenical discussions that are happening in other bilateral dialogues about authority and about the apostolic witness and the creed, etc. So, there's a Felix has just pointed out in the chat room, Carolyn, that sometimes the problem is that you're not using the correct mic, that Zoom has selected the wrong microphone on your computer. Anyway, so you typed, ironic that both the Church of England, Anglican, and the ELCIC from the Protestant Reformation were both descendants of schism, so much for recognizing apostolic succession. Yeah, I would say we're all descendants of schism in that respect, and let's not put it on one side of the ledger. But that's the first step. But the other, sometimes the reason that the churches have divided is because of matters of conscience, where they believe that they are in fact continuing in that apostolic tradition, and so that's not, that they're not losing it by the division, that they're retaining it and preserving it. So, but you're right, it certainly is an interesting question. How succession is understood in just using Anglicans and Catholics as the example still, I am very different. I've noticed that Anglicans tend to be much more attentive to knowing what the succession of their bishop is, and whereas I think, I remember, for example, at one point, back in the 90s, we had a church leaders meeting in Saskatoon, and each meeting, one of the leaders would do a little bit of history about their tradition and talk about their tradition. And so it was the Anglican turn, and Tom Morgan, who was the Anglican bishop at the time in Saskatoon, he was giving a bit of presentation, and one of the things he talked about was his succession, who ordained him, and who et cetera, going back down through, and he actually had some paper which outlined it like a family tree. And when he pulled that out, Bishop Weisgerber, the Roman Catholic bishop, he was just like wide-eyed. He'd never seen such a thing. He didn't know that people kept track of those sort of things. He knew who ordained him, but he wasn't quite sure who ordained the guy, before him. So, I mean, I'm not sure if Bishop Jim has been could look it up somewhere, perhaps, but certainly it wasn't something that he was holding on to. So there's different senses in which that tradition, is it important that it be a tactile succession, one bishop who laid hands on the next one who laid hands, or is there some way in which that succession can be preserved in a non-tactile succession? Can the apostolic tradition be passed on in other ways? So some of the pietistic Lutherans in Saskatchewan used to practice ordination by the congregation, not by the minister, certainly not by any bishop. So, but they certainly understood themselves to be apostolic. So that's an important continuing question. The commentary paragraph here: given the signs of growing agreement about the place of ordained ministry in the church, we are led to ask if the churches can achieve a consensus as to whether or not the threefold ministry is part of God's will. Sorry. Whether or not the threefold ministry is part of God's will for the church and its realization of the unity which God wills. I'm not sure who's making noise, but does somebody have a question on that or comment? To ask the question of whether or not the threefold ministry is essential is, I think, an important ecumenical one. The way in which it was asked here did raise some questions and some objections from people who come from a tradition that do not think it is essential. That it seemed to be presuming that those who do not practice this need to accept this, and even in some ways it echoes the way a similar question was asked in the Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry text about infant baptism and whether or not the Believers Baptist traditions need to accept infant baptism, and around the Eucharist, certain questions were asked in this same framework, same way of framing the question, which presumed that one side was the normative. It's not as obvious here, but it is certainly was something that people responded to. Okay, so
Nick,
yes,
can I
go ahead, Richard.
Richard Small.
Yeah.
Question. It seems to me this issue of succession, part of this hinges or pivots on whether or not it rests with one individual, passing it on to his successor. Okay, you know, like you were talking about, you know, tactile from one. Okay, and so, or does it? So does it rest in the individual, or does it rest in, I guess what, the community of believers? And
Right.
that's part of, I think, some of the differences that we see in the different churches. Um,
Sure.
they look at it as the authority of transition rests with the faithful of God, as opposed to solely, absolutely resting in an individual. It's not an either or. It's can be both.
I hope it is both. Yeah. Yeah. I certainly hope it's part of the charism of the community. The language of charism is, of course, one that is used in Catholic theology to describe this. I mean, by charism, we're talking about a gift of the Spirit, right? It's the Spirit endows the church, the Christian community, with apostolicity. But also, is that also a charism of the individual related to their ministry, and is that something that is identified in the act of ordination, or is that something that is pre-existing before the ordination, when there is a sort of a discernment of their vocation, when is ordination as simple as the commissioning by the church, or the authorization from the church that this person is authorized to function in their name, in their community, or is there something more, right? Part of that comes down to the classical difficulty around sacraments, as to whether or not to what extent can one particular each tradition, to what extent do we recognize that the church and the Christian community, by our ritual actions, can be a way that God is acting in the community, so that when the hands are laid upon the ordinand, can the church have confidence that the Spirit has gifted that person with the charism for ministry, right? Those churches that have a high sense of sacraments, a trust, a sense of assurance, I would say yes, that's what we mean by sacrament. For those traditions in which don't tend to think of these things as sacraments, but tend to think in terms of even of baptism and the Eucharist, don't tend to think in sacramental terms, but think in terms of ordinances, to do what Christ has commanded us to do. The designation of somebody as a minister, one would pray that they would have the gifts of the Spirit, the one that the Spirit would guide them, etc. But the assurance that a sacramental tradition assigns to that would not necessarily be found. Right? It's so. Once again, there's a variety of different traditions on a sliding scale, so they're not all. It's not either one or the other, but there's a tendency from a sacramental perspective to see an assurance there. Anything else?
I further comment. I speak as a Roman Catholic because that's my tradition. My sense is that when the bishop lays his hand on someone for ordination, the power does not rest solely in him. It rests in the church. He's just an instrument of the church.
I'm not just from a Catholic perspective. I don't want to say just.
Sorry, that's maybe a poor way of phrasing it. Sorry.
And I think that in light of the understanding of ministry that's described here, it's not that the bishop is not an instrument of the church. The bishop is an instrument of Christ, as all ministers are, right? Yeah. So there's that's the certainly one of the key points there. I'm looking at the time, and I know I'm not going to get through all the authority materials for next week, so we'll be starting on somewhere in here. Let's take a look at the authority material, though. Let's at least a paragraph or two. The gift of authority in the ministry of the church is the next heading. It says 48 says, all authority in the church comes from her Lord and head, Jesus Christ, whose authority conveyed with the word exousia, the Latin term for power, delegated authority, moral authority, influence, literally meaning from out of one's being. So Jesus, whose authority conveyed with the word exousia in the New Testament, was exercised in his teaching, his performing of miracles, his exorcisms, his forgiveness of sins, and his leading the disciples in the ways of salvation. Jesus' entire ministry was characterized by authority, which placed itself at the service of human beings. Having received, quote, all authority in heaven and on earth, Matthew 28:18, Jesus shared his authority with the apostles, their successors in the ministry of oversight, Episkopé, exercised authority in the proclamation of the gospel, in the celebration of the sacraments, particularly the Eucharist, and in the pastoral guidance of believers. One point I want to make here is that when we're talking about, as they describe here with Jesus, when we're talking about authority, we're not talking about power. There's a tendency to talk about to use synonyms like power or jurisdiction, things like that when we talk about authority, and that's not what this is about. There's an interesting development for in Catholic theology at certain points in medieval theology where there is some reflection on what or how jurisdiction is exercised by the minister in sacramentally. For example, in penance, in forgiveness of sins, to what degree does the priest, in absolving the sin, exercise Christ's jurisdiction, and to what extent is the priest exercising the church's jurisdiction? And medieval theology did distinguish that, but claimed that the church itself had that jurisdiction. So the sacramental theology and the canon law both explored questions of jurisdiction. We get into that when it comes to the roles of different ministers and the relationship of different ministries and things like that as well. So jurisdiction is not divorced from this question, as power is not divorced from it. But what we're talking about here explicitly is authority. What does it mean to say that this person in ministry is ministering in the name of Christ with Christ's authority, which is exercised not with power and jurisdiction, but with love, a number of other, however else we may describe this. So it's a different kind of authority, and the English terminology doesn't necessarily capture that. Anybody comment on this? Okay. The distinctive nature of authority in the church can be understood and exercised correctly only in the light of the authority of its head, Jesus, the one who was crucified, who emptied himself and obediently accepted even death on the cross. This authority is to be understood within Jesus's eschatological promise to guide the church to fulfillment in the reign of heaven. So that's where Jesus is authority comes, and thus the church's authority is different from that of the world. When the disciples sought to exercise power over one another, Jesus corrected them, saying that he came not to be served, but to serve, saying that and to offer his life for others. Authority within the church must be understood as humble service, nourishing and building up the koinonia of the church in faith, life, and witness. Koinonia, the communion or fellowship of the church. It's a Trinitarian terminology. It is exemplified in Jesus' action of washing the feet of the disciples. It is a service, diakonia, of love, without any domination or coercion. Anybody? Thus, authority in the church in its various forms and levels must be distinguished from mere power. This authority comes from God the Father through the Son in the power of the Holy Spirit. As such, it reflects the holiness of God. The sources of authority recognized in varying degrees by the churches, such as scripture, tradition, worship, councils, and synods, also reflect the holiness of the triune God. Such authority is recognized wherever the truth, which leads to holiness, is expressed, and the holiness of God is voiced, quote, from the lips of children and infants. Holiness means a greater authenticity in relationship with God. How's that for a definition of holiness? Greater authenticity in relationship with God, with others, and with all creation. Throughout history, the church has recognized a certain authority in the lives of the saints, in the witness of monasticism, and in various ways that groups of believers have lived out and expressed the truth of the gospel. Accordingly, a certain kind of authority may be recognized in the ecumenical dialogues and the agreed statements they produce, when they reflect a common search for and discovery of the truth in love, urge believers to seek the Lord's will for ecclesial communion, and invite ongoing metanoia, that's conversion, and holiness of life. That last section, speaking of the authority of the ecumenical dialogues, is the only ecumenical dialogue text I've seen that makes this kind of an assertion. It's an interesting thing, because one of the things we've seen developing over the 60 years of ecumenical dialogue is a body of ecumenical tradition, which becomes, in a way, a authoritative guide for churches in the way that they will address certain questions. The Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry text from 1982, the section on baptism is so widely accepted and significant and comprehensive that you will find a number of catechisms written by different churches and other catechetical materials since then that not only do they, instead of emphasizing one or the other of the elements of baptism that were part of that tradition, they now very carefully capture the 5 different descriptions of baptism that are found in that text. But they actually do so in precisely the same order. Catechism after catechism after catechism, you'll see these 5 meanings of baptism reflected there. It's a really fascinating development to see how that text has become, even though not officially received by churches as adopted and as authoritative text, has nevertheless become the go-to place. If you're going to write, a brief outline of baptism, here's your outline, and then let's flesh it out. But there's more to be said. But here's an important first step for any catechist working in this area. And so it has developed that. And in similar ways, other parts of other texts have a certain kind of authority as well. I don't know that this document it's certainly not there yet, but maybe someday it will. Parts of it will be recognized in that way. So we're at 4 o'clock, which is when we said we were going to stop. We will. Once again, we're planning to pick this up in 2 weeks. Moving on to the section about Episkopé, but we'll finish up this section on authority too, because they connect, right? And so we'll do that. Look at the section on Episkopé, and under the subject of Episkopé oversight, we'll return to the ministry of the bishops, but specifically, there's a reflection on the authority of ecumenical councils and the understanding of primacy. What does primacy mean in the church? And then specifically look as well at the papacy and the Petrine Ministry. So if you want to think a little bit about those things, consider this question. Think about the popes that you have known in your lifetime, or not personally, but that you've heard of and that you've followed, that you know of, and ways that people's attitudes towards the papacy have shifted over the years. Not just do you like this particular guy, but about the kinds of things that they've addressed, or the challenges that they have placed before the churches and called the churches to reflection. In what ways has the papacy become a ministry that is significant for all of the churches and not just for Catholics? In what ways can people say, I've heard people say, Pope Francis is my Pope. People from various churches feeling, this sense of that Francis is speaking for all Christians in some ways. So in what ways has that changed over the years? And what do you think are the reasons for that? Think about that for a little while, and we'll come back to that in 2 weeks. Anybody have any last comments before we end?
I put mine in the chat.
I was just reading it. Yes. You think it would be fruitful for an important discussion on the distinction between power and authority, especially as it pertains to parish pastoral ministry? Someone with having experience in parish pastoral ministry. Very good. Yes. I could certainly say questions about authority, and the corollary part of that is obedience. Sometimes, not the only corollary, but one of the corollaries. For the person who's never going to be the bishop, the experience of having to live with a certain level of obedience, or a certain kind of cooperation with the people who do have the authority. That has been, it's a challenge that we face, and especially if you're a layperson in ministry. And I probably should say less than more on that one. But I've been blessed by the ability to work with Don Boland for the last 10 years. So that's been a lovely, lovely thing. So anybody else? All right. Well, thank you very much. And we will see you in 2 weeks, if not before. Thanks.
Thank you, Nick.